Welcome to the Can't Make This Up History Podcast. I'm your host, Kevin. After World War II, the globe was divided in half between the capitalist West and the communist Soviet Union. Even though no shots were fired during the Cold War, the intelligence agencies of these two spheres were constantly vying for critical information that could give their side an edge. In the United Kingdom, Donald Maclean graduated from the right school. He attended the right university. He came from good British stock and he entered public service just as his country desperately needed intelligent and capable young men to help combat the rise of fascism in continental Europe. Donald Maclean was also a Soviet spy. My guest on the podcast today is Roland Philipps, and he is the author of A Spy Named Orphan, The Enigma of Donald Maclean. Roland went into publishing on graduating from Cambridge, and until recently he was the publisher of the author John Murray. He has edited leading novelists, politicians, historians, travelers, and biographers. Spy Named Orphan, his first book, arises from a lifelong connection to Donald Maclean, and Roland's grandfather was Roger Makins, Maclean's boss at the British Foreign Office. Roland is currently working on a new book about Special Operations Executive, the double-cross system, collaboration and resistance in the Second World War. He joins me today from the United Kingdom via Skype.
The You Can't Make This Up History Podcast, bringing you strange but true things from the past. It's not the average history that you learned in school. We're bringing you the heroes and bringing you the fools, and stories that are just too crazy to believe. The stranger than fiction and super unique.
Hi, Roland. Welcome to the show.
Hello, Kevin. Thank you for having me on.
Glad to have you. So you're the author of A Spy Named Orphan, The Enigma of Donald Maclean. And first off, let me applaud you on writing a very interesting and engrossing book. It was very captivating. I felt like I was reading a John le Carre novel.
Oh, well, that's wonderful to hear. It was a marvelous subject for me to find for my first book, and it really came about because I have a lifelong connection to Maclean, and through my grandfather was his boss in the British Foreign Office, the equivalent of the American State Department.
So you have a personal connection.
So I have a personal connection. And when I was told that the papers, the long-delayed government papers were coming out into the National Archives, I thought, now's the moment to start work on this book. It's my first book. I spent 32 years as a publisher's editor before deciding to strike out and write instead. One of the most enjoyable authors I edited was indeed John le Carre, so I feel sort of in tune with the spy book world.
Now, in researching this, you mentioned that a lot of documents have been declassified recently. How long ago was that?
Yes, at the end of 2015. I started the book in the middle of 2015. At the end of 2015, a lot of the British Secret Service and Foreign Office papers were put into the National Archives, somewhat overdue. I like to think they'd held them up because the story they told was of such government incompetence, really, that they were embarrassed by these papers. But I'll never be able to get to the bottom of whether that's why they were in so late. But they were a tremendous asset to me. Not least because when Maclean defected in 1951 to the Soviet Union, the government was so shocked, everyone was so shocked that this incredibly accomplished diplomat should be a spy and a defector, that they really went right back through his life, unpicking all his life to try and work out what had gone on. So all this was laid before me in the National Archives.
This is some of the first, your book is some of the first publicly available research on what Maclean did.
Yes, in the detail, the broad strokes were known, but the detail wasn't. And what in particular was never fully known was the hunt for the spy. Once they knew there'd been a spy, in the British Embassy in Washington in between 1944 and 1948. The hunt for him was the very drawn out, frankly incompetent affair, largely because they didn't. The British Secret Service and Foreign Office didn't believe that one of their own could have been a spy, so they were looking in all the wrong places. But that was the gems in the papers were, as they continued to fail to catch their man when he was staring them in the face all the time.
All right, well, let's go back to the very beginning for Maclean. You start out with his prep school, and you contend that the way he was brought up in this somewhat elite school kind of primed him to be a spy.
Yes, I think his schooling and his family background. His father was a very austere Presbyterian lawyer and politician. No smoking or drinking in the house, family prayers. He instilled in his children the need to follow their conscience, by which he meant their duty to God. But his son Donald took it a different way. And then his school was a school called Gresham's, very progressive school, on the edge of England, in Norfolk. And that had a very odd disciplinary system called the honour system, whereby the boys, they were all boys in those days, were meant to give themselves up if they transgressed one of three rules. And the rules were not to smoke, not to swear, and not to think impure thoughts, which is an extraordinary rule to have, and to say to boys, you have to surrender yourself for disciplining if you do that. And if you didn't surrender yourself, your fellow students could persuade you to surrender yourself, or if that didn't work, they could shop you. And W.H. Auden, the poet, was a year ahead of Maclean in this school, and he wrote a piece saying, if anyone wants to know why I'm a communist, it's because I was brought up in a fascist regime, by which he meant the school. But I contend that also, he was the first generation of Maclean's to go to a private school. His father had been brought up in very humble circumstances indeed, and he was certainly the first likely to go to university. He was a brilliant student, and I contend that as the pressure was on him to shine at school, and shine he did in every area, sporting and academic, yet he would have known this other disciplinary system was ridiculous. So I think he learnt to keep his true beliefs buried, while on the outside being a conformist, which was how he led his career in the Foreign Office. A great conformist, brilliant diplomat in the making, yet at the same time he was giving everything away he could, according to his conscience. And that conscience, which was instilled in him by his father and by his school, took him to some very dark places we'll come on to talk about. But he stood by it right to the end of his life.
So he had very little opportunity to express himself, and the overbearing nature of this system just encouraged him to bury things.
I think it did, yes, exactly, and his true yet at the same time to live by his true beliefs. So hide but live by his true beliefs. And then in the times he's brought up in, and when he went to Cambridge in 1931, of course Hitler was on the rise, fascism was on the rise. It was the middle of the Depression. He saw the hunger marches by which the literally starving workers of the north of England marched on London to take their plight before the government, and Maclean saw these. And so these external factors turned him towards communism, in common with many other of his colleagues at that time, his fellow students at Cambridge and elsewhere. And I think it was the combination of this following his conscience and the need to fight fascism led him quite naturally to communism. And then when he came to bury his communism as a spy, these other factors came into play, his childhood and schooling.
Now, living in the post-Cold War world, we tend to think, especially living in the West, of communism as an enemy ideology. Mm-hmm. But that really wasn't the case in the 1930s, especially in university, was it?
No. Communism was, of course, quite new. It was the Russian Revolution had only happened 15 years earlier, and it seemed pretty ideal, particularly compared to what was going on in Europe as Hitler seized Austria and later Czechoslovakia, and the stormtroopers started. I mean, the brutality that was clearly leading Europe to war, whereas communism was a religion was a organization of peace. Maclean believed, and others believed, that it advocated peaceful cooperation, no divisions between people. And right to the end of his life, he maintained that communism was the route to peace. It was what, after he defected, his wife told his sons that their father had gone to live in Russia because he believed in world peace. And we have to remember, it wasn't until we knew about the horrors of Stalinism, the purges and so on in the later 1930s, that anyone realized it wasn't a peaceful organization. I mean, it wasn't fun. Many British people who went to Russia didn't see people with higher living standards than at home. But for a theorist like Maclean, it seemed to be the only peaceful outcome.
And it seems in reading the book that he almost did have a bit of a religious fervor in his belief in communism.
I think that's right. I mean, he was brought up in this very religious household. He himself was not a believer in God, but he took the fervor that he'd seen in his father and the belief in the conscience. Follow your conscience at all costs, their father used to say to them, and he took that into communism.
All right, so he attended Cambridge in the 1930s, and then Maclean was recruited by the Soviet government, and he became part of what was known as the Cambridge Five.
Yes.
Can you describe this group a little bit? I, studying history, wasn't really familiar with it. I was exposed to it through a novel. Can you explain for the audience what the Cambridge Five were?
This was the Cambridge Five were a group of spies. I think they were communists at Cambridge together, as were many, many other people. But they took communism on after Cambridge, when most of their fellows gave it up and went into the professions. And I think to look at the Cambridge Five, we need to look at their recruiter, who was a brilliant man called Arnold Deutsch, who was Viennese and was a great psychologist. And Deutsch realized two things. First of all, that because of the rise of fascism and the Depression, the early 1930s, you could recruit as spies ideologues, purists, as it were. You didn't have to, as before and after, it wasn't to do with blackmail or bribery or any of those other things. You could recruit people who genuinely believed in the cause. He also, Deutsch, realized that if you could get people young enough at the great universities, Oxford and Cambridge in Britain, then they could pass almost unnoticed into the professions, where they would give away the secrets in time of those professions. And any youthful communist outburst could be put down to youth and high-spirited students. And he, first of all, recruited Kim Philby, who'd married a Viennese communist who was the year above Maclean at Cambridge. Kim Philby had married a Viennese communist, and that's how he'd come to Deutsch's attention. And at that point, Maclean was due to go into wanted to go to Russia to teach English to Russians and live the communist dream himself. But Philby, his Cambridge friend, suggested to him that he could be much more use. He got a very brilliant degree in languages if he went into the Foreign Office and worked undercover, and Maclean leapt at this. So the first two of the Cambridge Five were Kim Philby, who became very senior in the Secret Service, Donald Maclean, who became very senior in the Foreign Office. The next one to be recruited was Anthony Blunt, who became the King's and then the Queen's, when the King died, the King's keeper of pictures, which, although that isn't a position that makes you privy to many state secrets, it excited the Communist Party. Mm-hmm. Guy Burgess, who was with Maclean and Philby at Cambridge, who went into the BBC and then into the Foreign Office, and John Cairncross, also at Cambridge, who went into the Treasury and then worked at Bletchley Park, the great decoding place in the war. So Deutsch, so those were the Cambridge Five. So Deutsch, who was so clever at recruiting and spotting what he needed for a spy, managed to penetrate the Foreign Office, the Secret Service, MI6, the Royal Household, the BBC, and the Treasury. So he was pretty good with his. So those were the Cambridge Five, and Deutsch was brilliantly picked them at the age of 21. All these people.
Did the members of the Cambridge Five know about each other?
Maclean obviously knew about Philby, because Philby had recruited him, and he knew about Burgess. Cairncross probably didn't know about any of them. Blunt knew about Burgess. Philby probably knew the lot because he was the first, but they were kept very much apart, and indeed that would throughout the Russian spy network. They took great care to keep their agents apart. But they never sat and shared any spycraft together, except Philby and Burgess did right at the end, shared a house in the United States, which was in the end Philby's undoing. But so they may have known about each other, but they were certainly kept as far apart as could be.
All right, so it sounds like the Russians were able to penetrate a wide swath of the British government.
Yeah.
So Maclean specifically, what kind of intelligence work did he do for the Russians while he was in the Foreign Office?
Well, he went in when he went into the Foreign Office. He was told he would be a sleeper agent. In other words, he would be activated when he got high enough up. But because he went in right at the beginning of the Spanish Civil War, the first great struggle between communism and fascism in Europe, Moscow were obviously incredibly interested by that. So he was immediately giving away what the British, who didn't intervene in the Spanish Civil War, so saw both sides, giving away all the detail of that. Then he was posted to Paris in 1938, where he gave away all the telegrams to do with the build-up to war. He arrived in Paris just the day after the Munich conference of 1938 and left after the Nazis had taken France. So he was able to supply all the early days of the war. He was then in London, where I don't think he would have been able to give that much of interest to the Soviets. But his great period was 1944 to 8, when he was in the British Embassy in Washington, where we know he gave away all the negotiations for the end of the war conferences, Yalta and Potsdam, because he saw all the telegrams between Churchill and Roosevelt, where, for example, they agreed what their hold line would be for the borders of Poland. So there's one exchange of telegrams where Churchill and Roosevelt say they want the borders of Poland, New Poland, to be in a certain place. But if Molotov, the Russian foreign minister, insists, we'll move them 200 miles to the west. So Molotov knew he only had to insist to get a lot more Polish territory than he would have done. That's one example. He gave away all of that. He gave way after the war. He was on an extraordinarily secret committee in the Atomic Energy Commission. He was one of only 2 Britons on it, which controlled the Allied supply of atomic weapons, atom bombs. So Maclean, for example, was in charge of sourcing the uranium, which came from the Congo, which was a Belgian territory.
So it's not like he's some kind of low-level bureaucrat.
Absolutely not. No, he was going right to the top of the Foreign Office. They really trusted him, and he gave away all this material. So he was giving away the atom secrets before the Soviets had the bomb, for example, and was incredibly important. And indeed, when his time in Washington was up, I found a letter from him in the file saying, please, could he have an extra tour of duty, because they wouldn't want to hand on his secret work to anyone else. And his secret work was, he meant the atom bombs, but now, reading it now, of course, it's a double entendre for him to say that. So that was the great period of his espionage.
And that really goes a long way in shaping what would happen in the Cold War going forward.
It did. It absolutely did. So it shaped the borders of Europe and the way the Cold War started, the territorial. It also, I believe, gave Stalin the confidence to build his bomb, which he tested 2 years ahead of anyone in the West's expectations. I think it did some good. He was able to give away during the Berlin blockade, when the Soviets cut off Berlin, half of which was run by the West. And the Americans did some saber rattling and said they wouldn't be frightened to use atomic bombs. And Maclean was able to tell the Soviets that, in fact, they didn't have the atomic capability they were claiming, which I think meant Stalin sort of it stopped the Berlin blockade being ramped up into something more frightening than it was. So he did a lot of good. But no, he did shape the early Cold War, there's no question.
He had several code names over the course of his spy career. They start out calling him Orphan, his handlers do.
Yes.
How did he get that name, Orphan? And what did Tradecraft look like between him and his handlers?
Yes. Well, Deutsch was very gifted at giving good, apt code names, and Orphan fitted Maclean. I feel it's why I used it in the title of my book, because he was essentially a lonely figure. After his father died in his first year at Cambridge, that was when he became a sort of rabid, outspoken communist. Before that, he tamped it down, I think, out of respect for his father. And I think Deutsch recognized in him this slightly lonely figure wanting to prove himself, wanting to be praised for his work and so on, and which was what Deutsch and the other handlers gave him. So that first handler, extraordinarily enough, when I came to research this, the Foreign Office turned out not to have a security officer until 1940. So he was able every evening to fill his briefcase with documents. He would take them, he would meet his handler on the street corner, hand over his briefcase. They'd be taken away and photographed at night, and his briefcase given to him the next morning. So it couldn't have been easier in that first year.
He literally just walked out the front door with whatever documents he wanted.
The front door with whatever he wanted in his briefcase. There were no checks at all. What is extraordinary about when I came to look into all this is the degree of trust. Really, right up until he defected, people were saying, no, he's one of us. He went to the right school. He went to the right university. He couldn't possibly be a spy. And they didn't expect, they didn't know about spies, really, I suppose it's true to say. They certainly didn't think they'd be a man in a double-breasted suit who'd been to Cambridge. The spies there were giving away plans from how what was in aeroplanes and things. They were workmen in dockyards who were bribed. Certainly not these senior patrician diplomats. But Maclean was such a productive spy in his first years that they gave him a handler of his own, who was a woman called Kitty Harris, who'd been married to Earl Browder, who was secretary of the American Communist Party at the time. And extraordinarily enough, she and Maclean started having an affair that lasted until his marriage 3 years later. So, and the Russians found out that the person, Kitty, was sleeping with the mole, which was a huge security risk.
Conflict of interest, completely.
Absolutely right, yes. And what else she might be telling him that were he arrested, he could give away, or if he became a double agent. I mean, the ramifications were terrible. But when they found this out, instead of recalling her and dropping Maclean, and probably being recalled in 1937-8 would have been an execution for her, Maclean was so vital to them that they let things ride. Indeed, when he was posted to Paris, they sent her with him, and they put up with this terrible breach of tradecraft because he was so important to them.
Can you talk about just how productive he was? Some of the numbers that you share in the book are just staggering.
They are staggering, yes. There was one year when, I can't remember the exact number, but it was over 4,000 documents he handed over. I mean, really extraordinary numbers, by far the most productive of the Cambridge spies, certainly, because he had access to all this material. I mean, everything went through the Foreign Office in those days, and still does indeed. And London was the diplomatic hub of the world, and then Washington post-war, the diplomatic hub of the world. So he was always the man in the right place to see everything. And everyone trusted him. Everything was shown to him. He was able to take it all away with him. He also had a prodigious memory. And one of the things that made him a very good diplomat was his ability to take in a vast amount of material and synthesize it down into 1 or 2 pages for his bosses. And when there was security involved later on in the war, this memory served him very, very well, because he was able to read the documents and then boil them down. In the days when he couldn't smuggle them out as they were, he was able to précis them in a very effective way.
He's advancing very well in both his public professional career and in his espionage career. Let's talk about his personal life a little bit. At the beginning of World War II, he actually gets married. How does having a marriage affect his career as a spy?
Well, it was a very extraordinary. He met his wife after the war started. His wife was American. I think my theory about her is that she rather loved the danger aspect. She should have gone home to America. Her sister had from Paris, but she'd stayed on against the embassy advice. And it was the first winter of the war when they met. And Maclean later said that she was called Melinda, that she wasn't at all interested in him, thought he was a stuffed shirt British diplomat, which indeed on the outside he was. And to make her interested in him, he actually told her he was a spy. Again, a huge risk to take, but it worked, and that's when they fell in love. She still, I think, courted danger to such an extent that she wouldn't. The only black mark on his Foreign Office file is that he wasn't on hand to evacuate the British embassy from Paris, because he was off getting married 3 days before the Nazis marched into Paris. They then got out of France really on the last available boat. Before he met Melinda, he was still involved with Kitty Harris, which, as I say, the Russians were putting up with. She had to be dropped as the girlfriend. She thought that there'd been some change in him, and then he told her that indeed he'd met Melinda, and that was a change. So Kitty had to be dropped, which coincided with his coming back to London, and they would have had another handler then. But I think Melinda gave him the courage. I mean, she stood by him through some terrible behavior and events, which we'll come on to. And I think she gave him the courage to carry on being a spy. And so I think it gave his career as a spy solidity, as it were.
He starts to wear down after a while, and one theme that is in the book pretty prominently is a growing alcoholism. How did that affect him?
Yeah. Well, that, I think, started to show itself in America really after the end of the war. Of course, Russia was our ally and the Americans' ally in the war, however wary we were of them and their post-war plans. But at the end of the war, when the Cold War started, that was suddenly, for the first time, Maclean was working not only secretly and illegally, but for two different sides. And he was in America, his wife's country, and that felt to him like the triumph of capitalism over his beloved communism. And the first reports of his heavy drinking are in 1945-46, when he gets very drunk at Washington dinner parties, some quite grand ones with the owner of the Washington Post and so on, and starts to say pretty terrible things about America and about capitalism, and it's extraordinary to think that these are his wife's countrymen he's saying these terrible things about. So the cracks first start to appear at the beginning of the Cold War, but he very much keeps it together. There are one or two stories that it happens with very dinners, but he's still this superb diplomat in the day. Things get really bad in 1948 when he is posted to Cairo as number 2 in the British Embassy. And the situation in Cairo is that it was run by King Farouk, who was a terrible, corrupt man. We, the British, it was in effect a colony. We were propping up this corrupt regime. It was the first time Spain had seen firsthand real poverty in Egypt, and he was confronted with everything he hated, the capitalist regime being propped up by the West. Also at this time, he was neglected more by Moscow, who, of course, had loved all his material from Washington, but Moscow didn't understand that Cairo was actually an incredibly important place, the sort of fulcrum of the Middle East, and ignored him, rather. We don't even know the name of his handler at this point. And he, in 1948, soon after he went there, wrote to Moscow saying, "I've had enough being a spy. I'd like to be taken to Moscow now. I'd like to defect." And this was ignored. And I think this is when his drinking becomes really out of control. He's found on more than one occasion in a public park in Cairo in the middle of 3 in.the morning without his shoes on, asleep on a bench in blackout. He can't remember how he got there. This sort of outspoken behavior we hear about night after night. And yet he always, as his friend Philip Toynbee said, put his armour on and would appear in the office and would be nothing short of heroic. And none of this got onto his file. 1949, the first really terrible incident happens when he takes a boat party up the Nile, and gets very, very drunk, and there's a scuffle on the banks of the Nile, and he breaks a fellow British diplomat's leg in several places. And the diplomat has to go back to London. Maclean goes on holiday the next day. And again, I was astonished to see none of this appeared on his file, in his personnel files in Whitehall. But the alarm bells are certainly ringing for Melinda, and I hope for the reader of my book. And then the final act, a year later, by which time his alcoholism is way out of control, involves he and a journalist friend of his breaking into the American ambassador secretary's flat in Cairo, thinking it belonged to a friend of theirs, looking for drink, having been drinking all day, and trashing the place, breaking her bath in two with a great heavy mirror they took off the wall, throwing her underwear around, all that, and passing out. And the day after this, Melinda goes to the British ambassador and says, I think Donald's having a nervous breakdown, needs to go home. The British ambassador says, yes, of course. The whole thing is hushed up. He makes a call to his American colleague and says, poor man's not well, we've sent him home. Again, none of this appears on his file. So that's the height of his alcoholism. He has 6 months sick leave, and then says to the Foreign Office, right, I'm ready to come back to work, but I don't think I should have another foreign posting. So they make him head of the American department just at the beginning of the Korean War. And so extraordinary. Still, they've been looking for a spy codenamed Homer, which was his final code name in America, for a year or more by now, but they still couldn't believe it would be him, so they give him this very responsible job. So I think as his two sides, his diplomacy and his espionage, or his patriotism and his communism, start to pull apart in the Cold War, that's when he becomes Jekyll and Hyde in deep alcoholism. There's a record of him shouting at a friend of his, what would you say if I told you I was a communist, have been all my life? That's on his Foreign Office file, just says Donald up to his old tricks again in handwriting underneath it. And it was tearing him apart. And he was desperate, I think, to be exposed. He'd asked to be taken to Moscow. He was shouting this stuff out at parties. And I think his defection was a great relief to him when it happened. And interestingly, he was sober when he didn't stop drinking altogether, but there are no more reports of alcoholic breakdowns when he's in Russia. He's able to work hard in a foreign policy institute. He's a single man. He's a united man again, as opposed to one torn in half.
Yeah, he's a very psychologically complex character as you read about him in the book. He's got to bridge so many different lives and different ideologies. It's understandable why it affected him the way it did.
I think so too, and I feel I think in what I didn't expect to think when I wrote the book was how, although he was undoubtedly a traitor and all of that, I came to admire almost his strength of conscience and unity, and the fact that he did continue to believe in communism even as it nearly destroyed him.
They were looking for a man named Homer.
Yeah.
But they couldn't put together who that person was.
Well, they knew that Homer had seen some really important documents, because it was an American operation called Venona that decrypted a lot of espionage material. I mean, it was Venona that uncovered the Rosenbergs, for example. A lot of material, telegrams going to
communications data,
Moscow during the war. Yes, absolutely. And they realized that there'd been a spy in the British embassy called Homer very early on, and that Homer was sending pretty high-grade stuff. For example, the telegrams between Churchill and Roosevelt before the Yalta conference I mentioned earlier. And the immediate assumption, once the Americans had told the British that there'd been the spy in the embassy, and they knew it was coming from the embassy because the transmitter, the Soviet transmitter, had left on the Foreign Office serial numbers, so they knew it was coming from the embassy. Their first assumption, and there's a memo from the head of security at the Foreign Office, was it can't be a senior man. We must look at any secretaries who had a nervous breakdown. So from the start, they were saying none of our chaps would be capable of spying because we know them, we know their backgrounds. So they were looking in the wrong place for the start from Homer. They began to change their mind in about 1949, early 1950, in fact, when they, as I said earlier, Maclean often précede material, and they then thought, well, a secretary wouldn't be able to précede this accurately, this material, so we better raise our sights to who it might be. And then at that point, Maclean's name starts being on various lists of possible spies. MI6, the British Security Service, then when they realise it's got to be a senior person, they think we better send our best man to deal with this. So they send Kim Philby, which is lucky for Maclean because Philby is obviously able to obfuscate. He realizes exactly who it is.
And the authorities have no idea they're sending another Russian agent.
No. So Philby arrives in April 1950, realizes exactly who Homer is, and says to Moscow Center, "What shall I do?" And he is told to make sure Maclean gets out, because if Maclean gives away, he'll give away Philby for a start, who's a very valuable spy. So get Maclean out, but also they say leave him in place as long as possible because he's so valuable to us. So Philby thinks the best way of doing this is to seize control of the operation. So he says, now we have to go back a bit to 1938, when there was a Russian defector in Europe called Walter Krivitsky, who was a very senior KGB man in the Netherlands and France, who defected rather than being purged by Stalin. And in 1940, he came to Britain, and he told them about a spy in the Foreign Office who, when he'd been to KGB headquarters on leave, they always spoke most admiringly of this spy. And he didn't know the spy's name, but he knew various things about him, such as that he came from an old Scottish family, that he was under 30 at the time, that he sat on such and such a committee. He gave away a lot of detail, which for us make it perfectly obvious he's talking about Maclean. Philby says, has anyone looked at the Krivitsky material? Because he thinks that if he puts this out there, then they will immediately recognize it was Maclean, and he will be told what the plans are for Maclean and can then pass this on to Moscow to get Maclean out, because Maclean is obviously going to be caught at some point. So the British look at the Krivitsky material and go completely to the wrong man, because they, once again, can't believe this extraordinarily brilliant diplomat could be under suspicion. So 1950 goes by without Maclean being identified. He has his alcoholic breakdown. He becomes head of the American department, and it looks like he might get away with it. Then in early 1951, a very few words are decoded, which say that Homer will be coming to New York, or Tyre, as it was codenamed, frequently to visit his pregnant wife. And this was from the first week of Maclean being in America in 1944. And that is the giveaway, that only Maclean had a pregnant wife who was living in New York. So they know it's him. Yet they don't bring him in for questioning. First of all, they're absolutely appalled that this man could possibly have been a spy, because again they still believe, most of them still believe he's a true diplomat, and also they can't try him in court because the Venona decrypts are so secret that they can't be used as evidence, and they have no other evidence on him. So they put people to follow him around town, and who are very noticeable because Maclean was very tall and they tended to be rather short. So wherever he went, there'd be this rather shorter man scurrying behind him, and he absolutely knows he's being watched, and it's a slightly farcical situation. His wife's about to have another baby, so they think, well, they say we'll bring him in for questioning. We'll give her a chance to have the baby and then bring him in for questioning. We don't want to search his house. Well, she's heavily pregnant. It might be too upsetting. Basically, we drag our feet. We don't want to believe it's him. Some of us don't believe it's him. So we do nothing. We leave him in place. Meantime, Philby has Burgess has been sent back from Washington in disgrace for his own drunken behaviour. And Philby says, right, you've got to get him out of there, out of England. And so in the week after Burgess comes back to London, they concoct the plan of how to defect, then do. A slight footnote to this is that we're so embarrassed by Maclean that even though this has been an American operation that's uncovered him, the head of MI6 is in Washington the week after Burgess and Maclean defected, when people the public don't know, and the Americans haven't been told they've defected. When he's asked by someone in the FBI how they're getting on with finding Homer, he says, we've got 6 or 7 people in the frame, but nothing definite yet. So they just cannot bring themselves to say it's this man. So he was finally caught purely because his temporary Russian handler had given away that his wife was pregnant.
And so he is eventually caught. Well, caught's maybe not the right word. He's identified, but never actually apprehended. You actually begin your book, the prologue, with his defection and escape from the UK. It's an interesting story.
Yes, so he's been he knows he's been identified because of these watchers who've been on him for a month. He probably knows that they're not following him home because he lives in the country, and MI5 decide it will be too obvious to have people. He takes a train out of London every evening, and they think it'd be too obvious to have people in the village where he lives watching his house. So they sign off at the end of the day. They don't watch weekends, which the Foreign Office aren't told. My grandfather, who's his boss, that Maclean's being watched, act as normal. We don't want to rattle him. So when Maclean asked for they worked on Saturday mornings in those days. When Maclean says, could I have Saturday morning off? My grandfather said, yes, of course, because obviously he can't escape because he's being watched. That last week, Maclean and Burgess meet several times. Maclean is very, very calm, again, which I think is interesting now that die is cast and he's come down on the side of going to Russia. He's very calm. And their handler in London is a man called Yuri Modin, has found a boat they assume the ports are all being watched, which oddly enough, they're not. So he needs a boat where he finds a boat that cruises up and down the channel all weekend that doesn't officially put onto foreign soil, onto France. Therefore, passports aren't needed to be shown. But Modin finds out that it does stop at Saint Malo for breakfast on the Saturday, and books tickets for Burgess and Maclean to go on this boat. So he does a full day's work. It's his birthday, his 38th birthday, Friday the 25th of May, 1951. He does a full day's work. He has birthday lunch with a friend who comments that he seems more relaxed and jaunty than he has done for some time. He goes home to Kent. Melinda has cooked a birthday supper. Until I found some family papers of Maclean's, it was always assumed Melinda didn't know what was going on, but it's quite clear to me now she did. She cooks him supper. Burgess arrives. Melinda claims later not to know who Burgess was. After supper, they say, we've got to go and visit a sick friend in Andover nearby. They drive about an hour to Southampton, where they get on this ship at midnight, and that is the last they're seen of by a Westerner for 5 years. They jump ship in Saint Malo at breakfast time, take a train to Paris, take another train from Paris to Bern in Switzerland, where they have to hold up for 2 days, and 2 days later get on an aeroplane to Prague and my grandfather, when he was criticised for giving Maclean the day off, just has to say, nobody told me they weren't being watched at weekends. So that's how they get away on a Friday night.
That's an incredible story. Did it not occur to them that he might be a flight risk?
Well, this is what I mean about the bungling throughout. Is no, I think they thought, well, his wife's going to have a baby in a few weeks, and he may not necessarily know he's being watched. I mean, it was a classic tale of establishment, trust, and bungling, in effect.
So what's been the legacy of all this? What's been the legacy of Maclean and the Cambridge Five, both for the British public and for intelligence and government services?
I think the legacy of the British public was it was such a shock when Maclean defected. The word establishment used to mean the ruling class, as it were, was first coined to talk about the people who protected Maclean, the political and social network that protected. And it was the first crack in faith in the establishment. I mean, for 100 years or more, the British public thought these people know what they're doing, they're honest, they're patriots, all of that. And yet, suddenly, people at the heart of the establishment turned out to be traitors. And it was the first cracks in the establishment. That was the single biggest change for in the British mindset.
And how long after did the public learn about this?
10 days after the defection. It broke in the newspapers. And then the missing diplomat was a huge case. Really, for the next 5 years, they didn't reappear until 1956. They were taken to a closed city called Cubisher. No foreigners, no journalists were allowed in. And they didn't reappear until 1956. So there was always this. And Melinda defected, and another great shock 2 years later, 1953, with the children. And so the missing diplomats, as they were known, was one of the great mysteries and points of shame. So that was the great change for in the British mindset. I think politically, as I say, it affected the shape of Europe in particular after the Cold War and atom bomb. The intelligence ramifications rumbled on for 30 years or more, in the colossal mistrust between the British intelligence services and the American intelligence services, all that business about not telling them, not coming clean about our defectors and indeed our spies, and all that was a terrible blow to trust. And I think Le Carré's novels of the 70s, with that mistrust simmering, comes straight from Maclean and Philby turning out to be spies. So I think that's the really lasting impact. And I think it led to a mistrust of the whole network. I mean, when in the build-up to the Second Iraq War, when in this country we had what became known as the dodgy dossier, whereby the intelligence services or the government were proved to have misused intelligence material. I think it's just made us feel a lot less safe that these people can be in high up positions. And I think what we're seeing in this country now, I don't know if you've been following the poisoning of the former spy in Salisbury, that the Russians can just come here and the Russians can penetrate Britain to such an extent.
Yes. Theresa May made that announcement not too long ago before we're recording this.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. And it really woke the world up to just how deeply the Soviets had got into the West.
Roland, thank you for a fascinating discussion. Where can people get your book if they want to read more?
They can get it online from any online bookstore, and I hope in bookstores around the country in America. I haven't been there for a bit myself, so I haven't checked the bookstores, but they can certainly get it online.
All right. Well, thank you very much for coming on today.
Thank you very much for excellent conversation, Kevin. Thank you.
I want to give another special thank you to Roland Philipps for being my guest today. And I want to thank everyone for listening and for tuning in every couple weeks. If you enjoyed today's episode on Donald Maclean, feel free to go back and check out past episodes of the Can't Make This Up History podcast and subscribe to the podcast so you'll know right away when I publish future episodes. If you want to learn more about Maclean and the Cambridge Five, head over to this episode's show notes at www.can'tmakethisuppodcast.com/A Spy Named Orphan. There you'll find some of my personal reflections on Maclean, a link to Roland's book, as well as additional resources. The Can't Make This Up History podcast is also on social media. You can follow it on Facebook at facebook.com/can'tmakethisuphistorypodcast and on Twitter at CMTUhistory. I want to say thanks to some new Twitter followers: the Why Is That podcast, the History of Vikings podcast, Lewis, Assassinations podcast, Lego Classicist, and R.W. Clark Espionage author. I'm going to go out on a limb and say he writes spy novels. I'll have to check that out. Thanks to everyone for all their support. That's it from me. I'll see you here again next time for our next episode, which will air on November 9th.